Hi, I'm Jason Sullivan of Rathbone Group, and you might be able to tell from this cycling jersey, this video is going to discuss collisions between motor vehicles and bicycles. If you have a subrogation claim where your motor vehicle was damaged because of a bicyclist's actions, or you have an insured who is riding a bicycle and was struck by a motor vehicle, this video will help set forth the framework to determine who fault lies with. I always start with general tort negligence claims. I'm looking for the duty and then that breach who determine who is at fault for that loss. It's important not to forget that you need to have a breach of a specific duty. For motorists, it's really easy to find in the rules of the road or the motor vehicle acts that have been passed in all the states. These are our general things like you have to stop for traffic control devices or operate within the speed limit. Those are the important things that motorists have to do, and we're all really familiar with them. Bicycles are a little bit different as not everybody's familiar, and there's a lot more variation in between all the states and all the cities in terms of what laws they've passed that apply specifically to bicycles. You're going to want to make sure you understand exactly what the law was for the bicyclists to understand what their duty was to determine whether or not there was a breach. Some of the interesting variations have to do with whether or not bicycles are allowed on sidewalks. Some states have prohibitions. You're not allowed to ride a bicycle on a sidewalk. Others will allow them, but Hawaii, for instance, doesn't allow them in business districts, and you can't go more than 10 miles an hour. If a bicycle is not allowed on the sidewalk, then where's it going to be? It's going to be in the roadway more than likely. And there are rules in a lot of states about where a bicycle must be ridden when it's in the roadway. A lot of states have rules that it states it must be as far right as possible. Other places have rules that allow exceptions when making a left-hand turn or when passing a stopped or slowed vehicle. Some states don't even have those kind of exceptions, and so as a bicyclist you have to wonder, if I come across a stopped vehicle, am I allowed to pass it on the left, or what do I do? You're going to want to know where the bicycle is allowed to be. Other places have mandatory use lanes where if there is a designated bike lane or bike path, the bicycle must be on that and they can't be on the roadway. These mandatory use of separate facilities make clear that bicyclists are not allowed in the roadway and must be in these designated areas. So if you have a collision with a bicyclist who's in one of those areas, then there may not be any fault on that bicyclist. But if they're in the roadway when there is a bike lane right next to them, it's more than likely that a court would find fault on that bicyclist. Another area is passing by vehicles. This applies to motor vehicles. Many states have passed a law called the 3-foot rule, which basically says if you're going to pass a cyclist, you must do so and leave more than 3 feet between the edge of your vehicle or mirror and that cyclist. Other states just create a responsibility to go by a reasonable distance. In other words, pass at a reasonable distance, and that may or may not be less than 3 feet. Finally, there is an interesting rule called the Idaho Stop, and as you might guess, it applies in Idaho, although some states have some variations. Have you ever seen a bicyclist just fly through a stop sign or a red light, and you wonder, wait, they're on the road, the rules of the road should apply to them? Well, in Idaho, that's true, except a bicyclist may approach a stop sign or a red light, slow down, and if they determine that there's no oncoming traffic and it's safe to proceed, they can pass without coming to a complete stop. Minnesota has a similar law that requires bicyclists to come to a stop, but if that intersection is generated to change the light by the presence of a vehicle, and a bicyclist isn't enough to generate that change in the light, the bicyclist can proceed through against that red light or stop sign. Now, those are all the statutory or ordinances that you frequently may want to look at to determine whether or not there is a duty, a specific duty on the bicyclist in your collision. The other area is just the general standard reasonably prudent person. Just because a bicyclist is allowed to be in the road, or they're not necessarily designated to the far right or to the shoulder, now where are they driving? Is that what a reasonably prudent bicyclist would do? Same for the motorist. Even though there's not a law that says they have to operate in a particular manner, would a reasonably prudent driver do so? If the answer is yes, then there's going to be that duty on that driver to follow that. Some interesting examples, and these really come down to comparative fault. And what that means is comparative fault is usually a question of fact for the court. And so it's unlikely that you'll ever get a motion for summary judgment in these cases, because the court needs to balance what was the duty of the motorist, what was the duty of the bicyclist, and if there was a breach, possibly by both, how does that weigh in that state's comparative fault or contributory fault rules? If you have questions on comparative fault and contributory fault, we have 2 videos on those topics specifically. So looking at some particular case studies, there's an Iowa case where someone was riding a bicycle down a country road. It was not dark, it was getting later in the afternoon and the sun was starting to set, and they were going in a westerly direction. A car came from behind them and rear-ended them. Now, the motorists tried to blame the bicyclists. They said, first, you shouldn't have been on this county road. You should have been off on a bike lane or bike path. Second, they said, look, you were going west and the sun was setting and the sun was in my eyes. How could a motorist see you? Now, the court threw those things out. They said that the facts showed that the bicyclist wasn't doing anything other than riding straight down a country lane. The argument that the bicyclist shouldn't be there, Iowa does not have that rule. There's not that mandatory use of specific or separate facilities, as it's called, the use of a bike lane or a bike path. So in Iowa, that bicyclist had every right to be in the road, and the court found it absurd to say that just because the sun was setting, the bicyclist shouldn't have been on the road. You wouldn't hold that standard to a motor vehicle, and because bikes on the road in Iowa are treated just like motor vehicles, you can't put fault on the bicyclist for doing exactly that, going down the road. Another case in New York was interesting because it dealt with a bicyclist going on a one-way road, except they were going in the wrong direction, going against traffic on one-way road. They came to an intersection where there was a vehicle that crossed right in front of them and caused a collision. The question was whether or not the bicyclist was at fault for going the wrong way on the one-way road, or the motorist who clearly and without doubt failed to yield and struck the cyclist. In that case, the court found that motion for summary judgment was not appropriate because it was a question of fact, and the court and jury specifically needed to determine the bicyclist's fault for going the wrong way on a one-way street compared to the driver who failed to yield. A great example of what drivers should do, at least bicyclists should do, is another case out of New York, Sirland versus Shreeb. In that case, there was a vehicle going down the road and going to make a left-hand turn into a private drive. There was a bicyclist coming in the opposite direction in a designated cycling lane. Now, the car made a left-hand turn and hit the bicyclist, and the bicyclist sued. The motorist tried to put fault on that bicyclist, but the bicyclist had testimony, his own testimony, and I believe other witnesses, who stated that as the bicyclist approached that intersection of the drive and where that driver was about to turn left, he saw that vehicle, he stood up on his pedals to make himself more visible, he slowed his speed and attempted to make eye contact with the driver who was making a left-hand turn. When he thought he made eye contact and the driver acknowledged him, he continued to go forward. Now that driver made that left-hand turn and the cyclist attempted to avoid it but could not because of the timing and how close they were. In that case, the court found the cyclist did everything. First, they were in a cycling lane and they were allowed to be there, and they also had the right of way for oncoming traffic. But that cyclist also did a couple of key things. Slowed the speed, attempted to make eye contact, and made efforts to make himself more visible to that driver. In that case, the court said, look, the cyclist didn't do anything wrong and all fault is on the driver. So again, the thing to remember with these cases is you're going to probably have a comparative fault charge, and you're going to need to know exactly what duty each of the motorists and the cyclists owed to each other. And that may be very different depending upon the location, where in some places like Idaho, a cyclist doesn't even have to stop at a stop sign or red light if they believe it's safe to go forward, and other places that highly restrict where cyclists can ride and where they can be located and how they must operate. If you have any questions or have another topic you'd like to see on subrogation, please email us at video@rathbonegroup.com. For subrogation, I'm Jason Sullivan, and that's the long and short of it.